Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. So let's continue thinking about the Sabbath. We were thinking last time about the basic Old Covenant foundations of the Sabbath, and we hinted at their connection to the New Covenant Lord's Day. And then we also identified the primary command that is contained in the Sabbath command, the fourth commandment, that we should rest from our labours. And the implication of that, as it's fleshed out in the fourth commandment and elsewhere, that the reason we rest is so we can worship God. We rest from our ordinary labours so that we can worship, because this is a holy day, a day that God has sanctified, and therefore that we must keep holy and enjoy his presence on it. That's what he's given it to us for. So we rest so that we can worship. Okay, is that a good summary of the Sabbath? Well, yes it is, but no, it's not quite enough. Because what it can create is the impression that all kinds of work are necessarily a bad idea on the Sabbath. And although the command itself, the fourth commandment, specifically says that we should rest, that is, from our normal labours, it turns out that elsewhere in Scripture we discover that there are many kinds of work, actually, which are positively good to do on the Sabbath. And two categories in particular are worth thinking about. I want to share them with you today. Jesus makes these categories explicit in his teaching, as it's recorded in Mark's Gospel and also in Luke. And I want to read a couple of sections and just to talk you through them, so we can start to think about what kind of work, quote unquote, we ought to be doing on the Lord's Day. I have in mind Mark chapter 2, from verse 23 to the end, and then the beginning of Mark chapter 3, which continues straight after it. Mark chapter 2, verse 23 first. One Sabbath, he, that's Jesus, was going through the cornfields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck ears of corn. Uh-oh, that looks like work, disciples. You're reaping. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Clearly identifying this action of pulling ears of corn off and munching them as a form of work which they believed was forbidden. Jesus thinks otherwise. He said to them, have you never read what David did in 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 to 6? When he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, there's a fair amount of complexity there, especially the connection to 1 Samuel 21. You might be wondering why Jesus says that Abiathar was the high priest, when you look back and discover Ahimelech was actually the high priest in 1 Samuel 21. Ask me about that at Wednesday night Bible study if you're interested, and we can explore that together. But for now, let's just observe that Jesus takes the place of the great King David and says, it's perfectly legitimate for me to feed my men, or to allow my men to feed themselves when they're hungry. These are like the army of King David, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to do this kind of work which is necessary for their sustenance. Necessary work. That's the first category of work that our Reformed forefathers in the faith identified helpfully as the kind of work that is good to do on the Sabbath. Works of necessity, they called it. Works that you just kind of need to do in order to keep things ticking over. And we'll think about some categories that might include later on, but it might include if you're a parent, feeding your children, if you're driving to church, getting in the car and driving. All those things are kind of work, and you need to do them in order to function as a family and as a human being. Works of necessity. But Jesus continues, or Mark's Gospel continues rather, with another episode involving Jesus that identifies another kind of work in chapter 3. Let me read this to you. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. It's clear what they were thinking. And he looked round at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And at that point the Pharisees went out and immediately began to consult with the Herodians about how to get rid of this Jesus character. Notice here that Jesus, in the face of his religious critics, identifies another kind of work that it's good to do on the Sabbath. What our Reformed forefathers called works of mercy. Works which involve gratuitous acts of kindness to other people. You don't need to do this in order to stay alive, but somebody else is tremendously blessed by this if you do it for them. It's the same kind of thing that Jesus has in mind in Luke 13:15, after healing a woman with a disabling spirit in the synagogue. He says, look, and when the teachers of the law and the Pharisees and so on object, or in this case the ruler of the synagogue objects, the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox and his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? Ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? You'd set an ox free so it can drink. Why would you not set this woman free so that she's liberated from this evil?" And similarly, in the very next chapter, chapter 14, verse 5, "Which of you, if you have a son or an ox that's fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" You'd work on the Sabbath, wouldn't you, if you were trying to do good to other people? And that's the category of work that Jesus is talking about here. Luke 14, Luke 13, Mark chapter 3, works of mercy, works which involve showing great acts of kindness to other people. So you notice what Jesus has done here in interpreting the Old Covenant scriptures for us authoritatively to show us what they originally meant and how they should have been interpreted, and how we should live them out now under the New Covenant as we're keeping the Lord's Day. Jesus shows us that rest is good. Yes, rest is good. Worship is good. Yes, we already knew that. And there are kinds of work which fit within those categories. That is to say, works that you need to do just to stay alive. Everybody acknowledges that you need to do something. You can't lie in bed on the Lord's Day. If you don't get up and get dressed, you can't even get to church to worship God. And then works of mercy. It's good, positively a good thing. Not an exception to the Sabbath rule, but a manifestation of it. To be working in such a way that we're bringing blessing to other people. So what this does then, if you bring all these strands together, you generate a set of 4 or perhaps 5 priorities which ought to shape our approach to the Lord's Day. Let me enumerate them for you, and that'll then prepare us for where we're going in the next few videos. Number 1, rest from your ordinary work, so that you can, number 2, worship God. Number 3, in fellowship with other people. Worth saying a word or two about that. It is in the people of God, the community of the people of God, that God's presence is found, supremely in worship, but of course also in other contexts, fellowship and just being with one another. And so that's another wonderful way to spend the Sabbath time. And of course that's part of how Israel would have lived had they lived faithfully on the few occasions that they did. It's narrated in the scriptures. Have fellowship with one another and to rest together as a community on the Lord's Day, on the Sabbath, and now in the Lord's Day for Christians. So rest, worship, fellowship with the body of Christ, and then these 2 kinds of work, necessary work and works of mercy. Those 5 priorities, I think, can helpfully shape our approach as we go forward in the next few devotions to think, okay, how can we most positively and fruitfully enjoy this blessing that God has given us? The Sabbath was made for man as a gift from God for us. Now, of course, what that does is to generate a whole bunch of questions. And some of these we talked about in the Bible and theology class. One of the students asked, is homework a necessary work? Am I allowed to do my homework on the Lord's Day? We also talked about the issues that arise when you have someone like, let's say, the mum of a household who's doing as much of her usual work or even more besides on the Lord's Day to prepare all the food and do everything else for her children and so on. Is that part of what she ought to be doing? Or is there some sense in which she ought to rest from that work on the Lord's Day? What about jobs that require us to work on the Lord's Day? Are they legitimate for Christians? Police officer, working in the military, pilot, working in industries or utilities like the water industry or the power industry that can't just be turned off on one day of the week? Is that a legitimate vocation for Christians, or must we steer clear of it? And what about what our Reformed forefathers in some cases called lawful recreations, things like sports and games and watching TV, not that they were thinking of that. Things that we can normally do when we're resting Monday through Saturday, can we do those on the Sabbath? And some of our Reformed forefathers actually said no to that. I'd want to suggest that on the Sabbath, the Christian Lord's Day, it is legitimate to do many of those things, although we ought to observe some careful cautions and be wise about how we do it. But we'll get to those in the next few videos. For now, that's probably enough for you this morning. I hope that you have the rest of a good day. May the Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.